The first time Anthony Moretti noticed something was wrong was May 14, 1982, when Pittsburgh Steel announced they were suspending production at the Monongahela works. Not closing, suspending. Words mattered. Anthony had been at the plant for 22 years, ever since he was 19, the same day his father had presented him with the lunch pail that had belonged to his grandfather. 3 generations of Morettis, breathing the same mill air, punching the same time clock. Just temporary, the foreman said, not meeting Anthony's eyes. Market's soft. You'll be back in a few weeks. Anthony nodded, his calloused hands gripping the rail of the blast furnace platform where he'd spent most of his adult life. Below him, the molten steel glowed orange, the heart of the mill still beating. Heat rose in waves that had long ago burned away any softness in his face. He believed the foreman because he needed to believe him, because Anthony Moretti was a steelworker, and that wasn't just his job. It was who he was. That night, he didn't tell Karen about the suspension, not the full truth, just that they were cutting back hours, that things would pick up soon. He watched her set the table, pot roast on Thursdays, always pot roast, and felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. Their son Mikey was 13, growing too fast, needing new shoes every few months. Their mortgage payment was due in 2 weeks. Lou Donovan says J&L's cutting back too, Karen said, spooning potatoes onto Mikey's plate. His brother-in-law got laid off last week. Anthony nodded, mouth full of meat he couldn't taste. Market fluctuations. Happens every few years. Remember 75? This feels different, she said, but didn't press. Because it did feel different, even if Anthony wouldn't admit it. Something cold had settled in his stomach, something that had nothing to do with the unseasonably cool spring or the draft from the kitchen window that never quite sealed right. It was the same feeling he'd had at 17 when his father had collapsed at the dinner table, felled by a heart attack that the company doctor had warned was coming for years. A premonition of change that couldn't be stopped. The 2 weeks of suspension stretched to a month. Then 2. The unemployment checks came, but they were half what he brought home from the mill. Every morning, Anthony woke at 5:30 a.m., same as always, and made coffee in the darkness. He'd sit at the kitchen table until 7 o'clock, when he would have been getting off shift, then shower and change out of clothes he hadn't dirted. "Why don't you sleep in?" Karen asked one morning, finding him staring into his 3rd cup of coffee. And do what? The question wasn't hostile, just genuinely confused. Sleep meant wasting time, and Anthony Moretti had never wasted time. His father had taught him that a man's worth was in his work, in what his hands produced. Every day away from the mill was a day he felt himself becoming less substantial, like he was fading around the edges. In July, his unemployment benefits ran out. That same week, Pittsburgh Steel announced they were extending the temporary shutdown indefinitely. Anthony stood in the crowded union hall, shoulder to shoulder with men he'd known for decades, as the representative explained their options. "They're crying bankruptcy," the union rep said, his voice hoarse from repeating the same grim news at 3 different meetings that day, claiming foreign steels undercutting them. Japanese imports selling for 20% less. A man toward the back shouted, "So what are we supposed to do? Learn Japanese?" Nervous laughter rippled through the hall. Anthony didn't laugh. He was calculating numbers in his head, savings, mortgage, Mikey's school clothes for fall. They could make it through Christmas, maybe, if they were careful, if nothing broke. If Karen could pick up more hours at the hospital cafeteria. Trade adjustment assistance might kick in, the rep continued. Federal program for workers displaced by foreign competition. Retraining options. Retraining. The word hung in the air like mill dust. Invisible until it caught the light just right. Then suddenly everywhere, in every breath. Anthony was 41 years old. His education was the mill. His degree was in blast furnace operations and knowing when a pour was ready by the particular quality of the heat on his face. What exactly was he supposed to retrain for? August came. The mill sat silent, its stacks no longer trailing smoke against the Pittsburgh sky. Anthony drove past it every day, telling himself he was checking to see if there was any activity, any sign of life. In truth, it was more like visiting a hospitalized relative, a ritual of hope and denial. On one such drive, he saw Kevin Coletti, a crane operator he'd known since high school, standing outside the chain-link fence that now surrounded the property. Kevin's father and Anthony's had worked the same shift for 30 years. Heard they're selling off equipment, Kevin said when Anthony pulled over. He looked thinner, his perpetual tan faded to a sickly pallor. Who told you that? Kevin shrugged. Ronnie's cousin works in the office. Said they're liquidating assets to pay creditors. Bullshit, Anthony said, but without conviction. They can't dismantle 100 years of steel production. Pittsburgh runs on steel. Kevin just looked at him, pity and something harder in his eyes. Wake up, Aunt. We're dinosaurs. And that, he gestured at the silent mill behind them. That's the goddamn meteor. That night, Anthony sat Mikey down and told him college wasn't optional anymore. It was the first time he'd admitted, even indirectly, that the mill wouldn't be there for his son. But Dad, college costs money, Mikey said, his voice caught between childhood and the man he was becoming. We'll figure it out, Anthony said, though he had no idea how. By October, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette was running daily stories about the collapse of the steel industry. Not just Pittsburgh Steel, but all of them. J&L, Wheeling Pittsburgh, National Steel. Rust Belt, they were calling it now. As if the decay was already complete, as if everything Anthony had built his life around was already a relic. The numbers were staggering, 150,000 steel jobs lost in the region. In the strip malls and bars of Monongahela, Homestead, Duquesne, the same scene played out. Men who had never known anything but the mill trying to make sense of a world that suddenly had no place for them. Anthony applied for jobs. Construction, security guard, janitor. The interviews, when he got them, all ended the same way. Your experience is impressive, Mr. Moretti, but we're looking for someone with specific skills in. What they meant was someone younger, someone cheaper, someone who hadn't spent their life believing that hard work and loyalty meant something. In November, Karen took a second job at night, cleaning offices downtown. They passed each other like ghosts, her returning as he was waking, him often still awake when she left again. The house felt too big now, too empty, though nothing had changed except the absence of certainty that had once filled it. Anthony started drinking more. Not dramatically, not violently, just steadily. A beer with lunch, another with dinner, a third while watching the late news. Always looking for stories about the mills, about promises of reopening, about economic recovery. The news anchors spoke about market forces and global competition with the detached interest of people discussing weather in another state. The Christmas of 1983 was lean. Anthony had found sporadic work through a day labor pool. $8 an hour, cash, no benefits, no security. Karen wrapped empty boxes to place under their artificial tree, so it wouldn't look so bare. Mikey pretended not to notice when his main gift was a used typewriter for school reports instead of the Atari his friends were getting. The worst part wasn't the poverty. Anthony could have handled being poor. His parents had been poor, at least at the beginning. The worst part was the shame, the sense that he had failed at the one thing that defined him. That the promise America had made to him, work hard and you'll be rewarded, had been revealed as a lie. You know what kills me? He said to Karen one night, after Mikey was asleep. It's not the money. It's that everything I know, everything I'm good at, is worthless now. Like I've spent my whole life learning a language nobody speaks anymore. She took his hand across the kitchen table. Her fingers were red and cracked from cleaning chemicals, her wedding ring loose on a finger that had grown thinner. You're not worthless, Aunt. You've never been worthless. But he couldn't believe her. Every man he knew measured himself by what he produced, by his ability to provide. They'd been raised on stories of their grandfathers building America with their bare hands. The skyscrapers, the bridges, the tanks that won the war, all made of Pittsburgh steel, forged by men like him. In February 1984, Kevin Coletti shot himself in his garage. The funeral was packed with former mill workers, men wearing suits that hung loose on their frames, wives with expressions carved from the same stone as the grave markers. Anthony stood at the back, unable to look at Kevin's widow, remembering how just a few years earlier they'd all been at Kevin's daughter's wedding, flush with overtime money, secure in their futures. Could have been any of us, someone murmured behind him. Anthony didn't turn to see who it was. It didn't matter. It was true. The suicide was never mentioned explicitly at the union meetings that continued through that spring, but it hung in the air, another ghost haunting their diminishing gatherings. Attendance dwindled as men moved away, chasing rumors of jobs in Texas oil fields or North Carolina furniture factories. Each departure felt like another light going out in Anthony's world. One evening in April, he came home to find Karen sitting at the kitchen table with a brochure from the community college. "What's this?" he asked, though he could read the title. "New Careers in Computer Technology." "It's for you," she said. "They have a program for displaced workers. Federal funding. Free tuition." Anthony laughed, a harsh sound that surprised them both. "Me? With computers? I can barely program the VCR. It's the future, Aunt. The mills aren't coming back." He slammed his hand on the table, harder than he meant to. "Don't say that. Don't ever say that." But even as the words left his mouth, he knew she was right. The Pittsburgh he had known, the America he had believed in, was gone. The contract between worker and company, the promise that loyalty would be repaid with security, broken. That night, unable to sleep, Anthony drove to the mill. The security guard recognized him, looked the other way as he slipped through a gap in the fence. Inside, the silence was absolute. No hiss of steam, no clang of metal, no shouts of men coordinating a pour. His footsteps echoed in the vast building as he made his way to his old station. The blast furnace was cold. Anthony placed his hand on it, feeling nothing but inert metal. For 22 years, this machine had been alive under his care, roaring and breathing like some industrial dragon. Now it was just a hulking monument to obsolescence. His obsolescence. He sat on the platform where he'd eaten countless lunches, where he'd taught new hires how to respect the power of molten steel, where he'd once saved a man's life by pulling him back from a splatter that would have burned through to bone. "What am I supposed to do now?" he asked the darkness. No answer came except his own echo, distorted and fading. The next morning, Anthony woke up before dawn as he always did. Made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, but instead of staring into his cup, he reached for the community college brochure. Computers. The idea was absurd. His hands were too big, too rough for delicate keyboards and circuit boards. His mind too concrete for programming languages and abstract concepts. But what choice did he have? When Karen came into the kitchen, she found him filling out the application. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "Yes, I do." He looked up at her, seeing the worry etched in lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. "Because you're right. The mills aren't coming back. And I need to be more than what I was." That September, at 43, Anthony Moretti sat in a classroom for the first time in 25 years. The other students were mostly young, their fingers flying over keyboards with native confidence. The instructor spoke a language that seemed composed entirely of acronyms: DOS, RAM, CPU, COBOL. Anthony took notes meticulously, his handwriting cramped and laborious compared to the typing of his classmates. Every night, he studied until his eyes burned. It was harder than any physical labor he'd ever done, this rewiring of his brain. Some nights, he wanted to quit, to tell Karen it was useless, that you couldn't teach an old mill dog new tricks. But then he'd think of Mikey, now 15 and talking about engineering schools, and he'd turn another page in the textbook. The first time he successfully ran a program he had written himself, a simple inventory tracking system, nothing fancy. Anthony felt something he hadn't experienced since the mill closed: pride. Not the same pride as watching perfect steel pour from a furnace he'd tended, but pride nonetheless. By the spring of 1985, most of Pittsburgh had moved on. The news no longer reported on the steel crisis. It was old news, a settled matter. The city was reinventing itself around healthcare and education, what the mayor called the industries of tomorrow. The young adapted. The old struggled. Anthony graduated with his certificate in December 1985. No ceremony, just a piece of paper and a handshake from an instructor who told him, "You worked harder than anyone in the class." Finding work was still difficult. His age remained an obstacle, as did his lack of experience. But in March 1986, a small manufacturing company on the outskirts of the city hired him to manage their inventory system. The salary was 2/3 what he'd made at the mill, with none of the overtime that had paid for vacations and Christmas presents. But it was steady work. His first day, he packed the same lunch pail his father had given him, the one that had gone to the mill for 3 generations. It felt strange carrying it into an office building instead of a factory, wrong somehow. But by the end of the day, as he was leaving, a younger coworker pointed at it. "That's vintage, man. Really cool. Where'd you get it?" Anthony started to explain, then stopped. "Family heirloom," he said simply. "The mill never reopened." By 1987, they were dismantling it piece by piece, selling it for scrap to countries that were now making the steel America used to make. Anthony drove past occasionally, watching its gradual disappearance from the landscape, like a mountain being worn down by time. On one such drive, with Mikey beside him, now 17 and about to graduate high school, accepted to Penn State for engineering, Anthony pulled over at the overlook that gave the best view of the mill skeleton. "That's where I thought you'd work someday," he told his son. "Where my father worked, and his father before him." Mikey looked at the rusting remains. "Do you miss it?" Anthony considered the question, really considered it for perhaps the first time. "I miss who I was there, how certain I was of my place in the world." He turned to his son. "But maybe certainty isn't all it's cracked up to be. Maybe the best thing I can give you is knowing how to change when the world changes around you." In the summer of 1989, 7 years after Pittsburgh Steel had temporarily suspended operations, the last piece of the mill was demolished. Anthony watched it on the local news, sitting in the living room of the house they had managed, somehow, to keep. Karen sat beside him, her hand in his. "You survived," she said as the dust cloud rose on the TV screen. "A lot of men didn't." He thought of Kevin Coletti, of others who drowned in alcohol or despair, of marriages that had crumbled under the weight of lost identity and purpose. Yes, he had survived, but he had also lost something fundamental that could never be replaced. The certainty that hard work guaranteed security, that loyalty would be rewarded, that a man's worth could be measured in tons of steel produced. "I'm not the same person," he said. Karen squeezed his hand. "None of us are." That night, Anthony dreamed of the mill as it had been, alive with fire and purpose, men moving in coordinated patterns they'd perfected over decades. In the dream, he stood at his station, feeling the familiar heat on his face, the weight of responsibility in his decisions. But when he looked down at his hands, they were clean, the calluses gone, replaced by the smoother skin of his present self. He woke understanding something he'd been struggling toward for 7 years. The mill had never defined him. He had defined himself through the mill, through its permanence and solidity. Its collapse had forced him to find himself elsewhere, in his adaptability, in his capacity to learn, in his willingness to become something new. Outside, Pittsburgh was changing too. Where mills had stood, research centers were rising. Young people who would have once followed their parents onto the mill floor were studying computer science and biotechnology. The city was remaking itself, painfully but persistently, just as he had. Anthony Moretti had once believed a man was what he produced. Steel, in his case. Something tangible you could point to in a skyscraper or a bridge and say, "I helped make that." Now he understood that what mattered was not what you produced, but who you became in the producing. Not the steel, but the forging. Pittsburgh would never again be the steel city of his youth. And he would never again be the young man who had stood before a blast furnace feeling the certainty of his place in the world. But perhaps that was as it should be. Perhaps that was the story of America itself, not a promise of permanence, but a challenge to reinvent, to adapt, to find new ways to matter in a changing world. In the darkness of his bedroom, listening to Karen's steady breathing, Anthony finally made peace with the ghost of the steelworker he had been, not by forgetting him, but by recognizing that he had always been more than his occupation, and that the strength that had served him in the mill had not abandoned him when the furnaces went cold. That strength had simply been reforged, like steel itself, under the pressure of necessity. Different now, but no less real, no less his own.